So Marty issued the invitation for me to be here. And of course, I misinterpreted what he said. So in discussion.
When I was Jim's department, then we had that problem a lot.
So I was comparing notes with my colleagues from the other two regions of NPDN this morning about what are you going to do? And one of them commented, well, the last thing they want to hear is a list of things. So that's, of course, what I had done. So if you all want to check your email or get some more food, that's okay. Now, my interpretation of what Marty wanted to do is tell what's going on in your region. So that's what I'm going to do. To start, in Kansas, we stand on the treaty lands of the Kaw Nation. We have 4 federally recognized tribes: the Kickapoo, Prairie Band, Potawatomi, Sac-and-Fax, and the Iowa tribe of Kansas and Nebraska. So just to orient everybody, the Great Plains region geographically extends from northern Mexico into Canada. When we look at it just from the U.S. perspective, it encompasses all or some of 14 states. When we talk about the National Plant Diagnostic region, it's these 8 states you see highlighted here. We have large-scale agricultural systems, specifically wheat, maize, soybeans at very large acreages. This region is important agriculturally for the following reasons: 5 of the top 10 states for wheat, 3 of the top 10 states for corn, 4 of the top 10 states for soybean, 5 of the top 10 states for alfalfa, 5 of the top 6 states for sorghum, 5 of the top 10 states for sugar beet, 2 of the top 6 states for potato, 3 of the top 6 states for dry beet. Approximately 1/4 of U.S. cropland is in the northern Great Plains. So it's fairly important from an agricultural perspective. 2 of the nation's top 10 states for ag research or ag cash value are in the Great Plains, Kansas and Nebraska. And in this region, plant-based agricultural systems are fully integrated with animal-based agricultural systems. But we also on the left, my screen on the left, on the western part of the region, we have some significant forests from Jan Leach's neck of the woods. And a very long list of recent and substantial introductions and subsequent invasions in the region. I'm not going to describe very many of these, but 1,000 cankers of walnut, fusarium causing sudden death of soybean. Some of these have had substantial impacts either on ecosystems or on the industries that they are involved in. And some of these are slow moving. They're gradually moving across the region. Some of them are very rapid. This last one, pine wilt, massive pine deaths in the eastern half of Kansas alone. But some of these are moving, just progressing across the Great Plains. Everybody's heard of emerald ash borer. Disclaimer here. These images are not from the Great Plains. I pulled them off the web. But this is becoming a big problem in the Great Plains for this reason. 60% of the forest resources in the northern plains are ash trees. 25% in the central plains are ash trees. And emerald ash borer is progressing its way across the plains. You can see here, it's now present in several of the Great Plains states. The impacts of this will be realized over the next 10 to 15 years. This is an image from Pennsylvania, but just to give you an idea, this is mostly dead ash trees. So the impacts are substantial. To my knowledge, there's no direct climate change causal relationship with emerald ash borer, but I'm love to hear about that if people think that's not a correct statement. Mountain pine beetle. It's the Great Plains, so the beetles are quite big. Mountain pine beetles are killing pine and spruce trees throughout the region. According to the U.S. Forest Service, up to 100,000 trees a day during the peak kill period. Bark beetles have killed about 5% of the acreage of forest from the Yukon down into Mexico along the Rocky Mountains. So that's substantial. This is north of Denver. And you can drive north of Denver and whole hillsides are dead trees. And this is very significant from a water quality standpoint for the Denver metropolitan area. It's killed almost all the lodgepole pines in northern Colorado and southern Wyoming. And it's very impactful to see this. Bark beetle outbreaks are natural. They're not new, but there is a strong climate change impact. This in the sense that the mild winters are not killing off a lot of beetles, so they're emerging early in high populations, and they're getting an extra brood in per year. So the feeding damage is progressive. Another new one, bacterial leaf streak of corn. Another one, Jan Leach is very well acquainted with. So I thank Tamara Jackson and Kevin Cordes from Nebraska for providing with these images. But in 2014, samples started arriving at the diagnostic lab in Nebraska. Bacterial screening from the leaf lesions ultimately led to a diagnosis that it was a Xanthomonas species. The one that was known to occur in the region was Xanthomonas campestris papaver holsicula, but the diagnostic test for that species, that papaver, was negative. These are what the symptoms look like on the leaves and on plants, ultimately progressing to a necrosis that has an impact on photosynthetic ability and ultimate yield. But this is the way it played out. Ultimately, thanks to Jan's lab, they diagnosed this as Xanthomonas vesicola, papaver vasculorum, from Southern Africa. How it got introduced is still a debatable question, but I'll leave it at that. Xanthomonas is known to be seed disseminated, and that's possibly one way it got into the region, probably most likely. But the issue is this: in the interim between the first detection and trying to figure out what it was, there were no restrictions placed on the agriculture in the area. So the consequence of that is this: by the time they figured out what it was now present in 41 counties in Nebraska instead of 1 or 2, and it subsequently spread to 10 states. So again, no identified climate change causal relationship that I'm aware of. Tar spotted corn is another one that first reported in the U.S. in 2016 in Indiana and Illinois. Subsequently in the Great Plains in 2022, probably showed up in 2020. But it's now moving across the Great Plains, as you can see here in this graphic. Just in Kansas alone, it's now in 15 counties, up to 20% loss in some of the fields in the northeast part of the state. Again, I don't know of a climate change causal relationship. However, here's the feature story, corn stun. So we started getting calls. This is now 2024. We're talking about something that happened this year, is ongoing right now. We get calls in late July, early August from a neighboring state saying, "Are you getting samples with these symptoms?" And that was from Oklahoma Plant Diagnostic Lab. We all subsequently that same week received samples. We sent them down to Oklahoma because they had been inundated with this issue for about a month. And so they were up and running with the test. Once they came back positive, we notified regulatory officials. Press releases went out from Oklahoma, Missouri, Kansas. We now have a corn stunt outbreak in the Great Plains. Historically, this was a disease first described in the United States, in Florida, I believe, maybe southern Texas, I'm not positive about which. But over the years, it had remained in that part of the country without really moving anywhere. But this outbreak was first reported in Oklahoma this past summer. It is the pathogen is vectored by a leafhopper, the corn leafhopper, Dalbulus matus. It can disperse about 20 kilometers on its own, unlike other leafhopper species, which can disperse much further. So we looked at the wind patterns for speed and direction, and definitely the prevailing wind direction supported moving these populations up out of Texas into Oklahoma and then subsequently into Kansas and other states. But significantly, one thing, weeks earlier, we had straight line winds of 80 miles an hour due to some very significant storms. And I'm sure we were the recipient of many leafhoppers from those winds. Climate change induced range expansion has been reported for several leafhopper species. So it's quite possible that this is a case where climate change is the ultimate responsible factor for why we're seeing this outbreak. This is the vector, Dodulus matus. It's one of the diagnostic features are these two large black dots between the eyes. On the leaves, you'll find black mold from growing in the frass from the insects. We went through, when we did the survey in Kansas, we went through cornfields and you just spread the corn plants and clouds of leafhoppers. So it was very well established. It's native to the Americas, primarily the center of origin is believed to be southern Mexico, can simultaneously transmit multiple pathogens. It's the primary vector for the spiroplasma that I'm going to talk about in a second. But most of this is about the Americas. It's not known to occur in other parts of the world. These are some of the other pathogens it transmits, this leafhopper, maize rhizophenovirus, maize mosaic virus, maize bushy skunk phytoplasm. So this one leafhopper species vectors a spiroplasma, a phytoplasma, an RNA virus, and a DNA virus. And it just kind of let that sink in a little bit. This is a very impressive leafhopper. So the symptoms, what does this thing look like? Well, oftentimes the plants are stunted, but the initial leaf symptoms are yellow stripes along the margins. They become reddish purple as the disease progresses. You'll get near proliferation. So normally where you'd have one, occasionally 2 ears per stalk, you're seeing multiple ears per stalk. But the ears are not well developed. So sometimes there are no kernels, and sometimes the kernels are very misshapen. If you look, this is a transmission electron microscope image. These are the spiroplasmas in the phloem. So they basically plug up the phloem, and hence you don't get grain fill. It's a molecule which is a wall-less bacterium. You can go out into a field, and we did this. This is from that survey we did. Go out into the field. Of normal corn is about 2 meters high, but if you look throughout, you'll find patches where the plants are stunted. And interestingly, even at the end of the season, when the crop dried down, a lot of those impacted plants stayed green. They didn't dry out. I have no idea what that's about. But I mentioned the proliferation of ears. We saw in many fields at least 2 ears, sometimes 3 ears, sometimes 4 ears, sometimes 5 ears. And the winner was, in one field, we found some plants that actually had 7 ears on one stalk. And I remind you, those are not impressive ears if you're looking for grain. So it's a very interesting disease that we're still trying to get a handle on. When we did that survey, these are counties that were surveyed. So it's not, we didn't do surveillance in the white one. So I suspect that the impacted counties were much greater than what you're seeing here. But what you can see is it was basically all over Kansas. So far, only the spiroplasma of the potential pathogens that the vector disseminates, but I would urge caution in that because it's the only one we have a test for so far. So it's quite possible some of these other ones are also present. When we look at a potential climate relationship, it's kind of hard to sort out when we believe the pathogens all over this disease is all over the state. This on the left is a temperature map, and You can see there's some variation there, but we've had much above normal temperatures in the summer months of late. Average temperatures for April, May, June combined ranks in the top 10 warmest in 130 years of records in all 9 Kansas climate divisions. So it's quite possible there's a climate component to this. Doubtful on the precipitation side. This is a precipitation map for Kansas during the growing season. We've had above average precipitation in some areas of the state and below average in other areas of the state. So these are the known positive states for this occurrence, this outbreak this year. And if you just look at that, originally this was confined to southern Texas, southern Florida, maybe southern Mississippi, and southern California. Yes, Neil, you have it too. But look at this year, all of a sudden it's up in New York and quite likely Minnesota. I don't know quite how to explain that. Pretty impressive. So for many years, southern US occasionally caused damage. In Brazil, where this has been a problem for many, many years, prior to 2015, so we've been in close communication with our colleagues in Latin America, where they've been dealing with this for a long time. Prior to 2015, it's been spatially and temporally sporadic and only occasionally causing significant damage. But since 2015, it's been annual and widespread, causing significant damages to the point where they've altered the planting dates of maize to escape the vector. 2024, sudden widespread issue in the Great Plains, and interestingly, the exact same thing has happened in Argentina. So I don't know how you could explain that other than either some massively contaminated seed system or just climate issues around the Western Hemisphere. Corn leaf hopper is the primary reason for the sudden massive outbreak. Climate change induced range expansion has been well documented in several other leaf hopper species. Our issue is how far north will the vector overwinter? And I want to make a point here that when we look at some of these climate effects, it's not just in the area that is our concern. So let me speak from Kansas's perspective. It doesn't have to overwinter as far north as Kansas to become our problem annually. If it just moves up and it's overwintering in the southern half of Oklahoma, we've got a problem next year. So we have to kind of look at it. It's not just Kansas's issue if it overwinters in Oklahoma. I mean, it's not just Oklahoma's issue. It's also the rest of the Great Plains issue. And this is another case. This is the potato leaf hopper. And we look at some of the effects we're looking at, and this is going back to the presentation that you made it. One of the interesting things I found was the way you phrased it, and that was a host range shift. And you tended to not use the word host range expansion. And they are two different things. And is that deliberate?
Yes. Yeah.
We'll talk about that later.
Okay.
But anyway, the potato leaf hopper is very definitely experiencing range expansion, meaning it is remaining prevalent in its existing area and it's moving into additional areas. Consequences: earlier and more severe disease development and disease prevalence in new geographic areas. And that's it on corn stunt and the leaf hoppers. I think that's probably our best case for climate change impact in the Great Plains currently. This is just because it's odd, and it's, what's up with Pantoid? So this species is bizarre to me, but this Ananias, the species causes disease on eucalyptus, maize, onion, very wide host range. this is what the host range looks like. Just kind of scan that list. So clearly very host specific. It's pathogenic on multiple plant species. It's parasitic on fungi, epiphytic on, endophytic in multiple plant species, seed-borne and globally disseminated crop species. Pantodia ananatus and other Pantodia species are among the most common species in seed microbiomes globally. So, of several plant species. So this is a really widespread organism. But here's what the story starts to develop and become interesting is it was determined that it's colonizing rust spores, peanut rust spores. And I think that's a brilliant dispersal strategy for this bacterium to hop on a fungal spore that is widely disseminated by wind. So that's brilliant. In 2009, Teresa Coutinho in South Africa published a paper along with Vector on we ought to be paying attention to this species. And she has experience, and we should have probably paid attention, because in 2020, there was a report out of Poland, a new bacterial disease affecting wheat plants. And then they inoculated some plants and got clear symptoms or able to reproduce symptoms that they were seeing in the field. 2022, first report of Pantodia ananatus causing leaf streak disease on wheat in South Dakota. 2022, this is the South Dakota leaf symptoms. 2020, first report of Pantodia ananatus on peanut in Texas, causing a disease they're calling early seedling decline. And this is what some of the seedlings look like. 21, 23, first report of rice bacterial leaf blight caused by Pantodia ananatus in Arkansas. And this is what the symptoms look like. It may be vectored by the rice leafhopper. And then in 21, 22 on corn, this new disease called late season decline of corn. And this is what it looks like. All Pantodia ananatus related, maybe, but you want to know, Marty, what was happening in the Great Plains? This is what's happening in the Great Plains. I have like no idea what's happening in the Great Plains. This one's kind of strange that it's something that's globally disseminated already, and all of a sudden these are starting to happen. So what's happening? Is it climate that's selecting for this? Maybe. I'll leave it at that. So 5 new diseases caused by Pantodia ananatus. That's because I left one off, and that was the one on guar. In 5 years, not likely host jumps. Previous reports on some of these hosts. Pathogen is very common, seed inhabitant. Anthropogenic facilitation is what I call it. I mean, because we're moving it everywhere. So it could be that with the amount of genetic exchange that's going on, they're just changing genomic islands that are allowing for host adaptation and remixing of virulence genes. I see Jan nodding her head. Is that what you suspect?
That's what we suspect, but also I would say that in Arkansas and Louisiana, we're thinking that there's a temperature effect because the guy that walks the fields and sent it to us said that he thinks there's a climate that a high temperature. And I think it's an endophyte gone wild, and it's picked up genes from some of the other. That's the hypothesis we're working on right now.
Yeah, actually, no, that makes sense. So is climate change facilitating emergent dissemination? Quite possibly. So what are the attributes associated with the emergence of new pathogen or new disease? Well, occurrence on a new host, this goes to the question earlier. Occurrence on a new host, occurrence in a new geographic location, higher prevalence and or severity, new genotype of the pathogen. So those are attributes associated with emergence. One of the challenges we have is attribution in the presence of enormous background noise. I don't even try to describe how much background noise there is. So when we want to attribute something to climate change in this arena of plant disease, it's very difficult. There was a paper published in Nature just a couple of years ago, widespread homogenization of plant communities in the Anthropocene. This is a graphic they used to show just how much exchange there has been, how much movement there has been in plant species. So those numbers in parentheses are species, I believe, exchange of species. If we repeat that same analysis, they did, repeat that same analysis at lower taxonomic levels of discrimination, you see this. You go from 2,400 to 66,000 genotypes that have been exchanged. And when we're looking at plant pathogen interactions, the genotype is more important than the species. And so this is a very significant graphic to my way of thinking. And you're looking at the exchange of whole phylogenetic lineages. We have been moving multiple genetic lineages of each species. So when you put all that together, those lines become thicker and more problematic for us. We're not just moving species across the planet, we're moving genotypes, genomes, and phylogenetic groups. From a plant disease management perspective, this is very difficult because it becomes the basis for future exchanges of genetic information. And then the recombination events that are going to lead to new virulence types. We have eliminated the geographic boundaries that allow genetic diversification and ultimately speciation. So Karen, I'm back to my thing that about 15 years ago I talked to you about. So essentially what we have is virtual Pangea. The geographic boundaries are irrelevant. We put plants on ships and transport them across oceans. We put them on airplanes and fly them over mountains. So geographic boundaries have become largely irrelevant. We are engaged in a tremendous global scale genetic mixing experiment. And so when we try again to attribute something specifically to climate change, I think we're asking the wrong starting question. And that emergence in our selection in one geographic area will be rapidly disseminated globally. So attribution is difficult due to the complex nature of major factors, the substantial background noise in these systems, and compounded by a lack of clear understanding of the interactions. So all of the above are happening now. Difficult to attribute specifically to climate change, but maybe that's not the point. It's the confluence of several interacting factors that we need to be focused on. We cannot consider them individually. These are systems level problems, require systems level solutions. If we treat these things individually, we will fail collectively. I took a quick look at our national data repository from the NPDN, National Plant Diagnostic Network. And these are first reports. They're not necessarily first occurrences. It's the first time it's been officially reported from that state. But if we even discount them by some large percentage, the numbers are still impressive. In GPDN, just my region, 1,400 first reports in the last 5 years. So cut it in half. Cut it to 80%. I mean, that's still a big number of new things to be dealing with in a region where the cropping systems are largely homogeneous. Okay, now go to the Western region or some of the other regions where the diversity of crops is much greater. Those numbers, I don't even know I don't want to know what they look like in your region. But attribution was difficult due to the complex nature of the major factors, the substantial background noise in these systems, compounded by a lack of clear understanding of the interactions. So what's the reference database that we should use for attribution to climate change? Unfortunately, I don't have an answer for that. We need systems level approach to this and not isolating one of these factors from the others. That's it, Marty.
Apologist, and you've made me depressed. So Jim, you talk about all the movement of this plant germplasm. We know that organisms, organisms get moved with seeds with plants. If I take a leap in logic here, climate change introduces the opportunity for some of those organisms to survive when they might not have 50 years ago.
Well, it changes the whole equation. So first of all, say we just isolate temperature from the climate change. It's going to affect the host. It's going to affect the pathogen. It's going to affect the vector. It's affecting all of those and the communities that they're in. The comments about the weeds, that's got me terrified because that's where a lot of our pathogens survive. So when you start looking at community level, it's really hard to have. So being the skeptic, it's hard for me to have a lot of confidence in the pest risk analyses we do. Especially if you consider that, how do we do a PRA? And we look at the last 10 years, the last 20 years, the last 30 years of the weather record, right? Well, if the future's not predictable on the past, then what are you learning from doing that? And when I looked at some of the maps about some of the changes in range and things like that, yeah, I don't know. I don't know how we get on top of this. I think there's no way we're going back from this global trade road. We're too far down that road to change that. I think, and we've had some conversations in the network about this, how we need more surveillance. My personal perspective is that prevention is overrated. We have about 4 decades of experience showing it doesn't work very well. So yes, we need to do it, but it's not very effective. What we need is early detection. And we don't do that very well globally, not just the US, but globally, we don't do surveillance very well. We need more effort on that side of this if we're going to get on top of some of these things. So I hope I didn't answer your question.
You never have. Other questions for Jim
I don't have a question. This is Allison.
or
But
comments?
yeah, that slide that you had of Kansas and the counties that you surveyed for, and you said, well, we only surveyed for this one thing because we only have a test for that one thing. I think another piece of that active looking for is having the diagnostic test available so that we can figure out what we have.
Yeah.
It's huge.
Totally agree, and hopefully NIFA is generous. We submitted a proposal last August to start addressing some of that. We'll see if it gets funded or not, but you're exactly right. I mean, we tend to wait until we have a problem, and then we assess whether we're prepared for it or not. And, you know, do you have the detection identification tools in place for some of these that are likely to be on the horizon? The answer is no, we don't invest in that. We wait until there's a problem. I'll throw in one last thing. So I think one of the things NIFA did really well this past year on the climate side was create a program that's called the Rapid Response to Disasters. It's not called that. That's what it does. I forgot what the
Extreme events.
Thank you. There we go. I like that program. I think it makes a lot of sense. But we need the equivalent on biological invasions. You know, so here's the deal. We have this new problem in the Great Plains. But we don't find out until July and August, which is after the grant submission deadline. So now we're going to submit our proposals next summer, and it'll be another year. So we'll be 2 years behind before we get any funding to actually study something on a new introduction. They need that rapid response, that rapid turnaround mentality for invasive species that we now have for climate disasters. I think that makes a lot of sense. It's a great program.